If you sign here, we can finalize the arrangements today. I've highlighted the crucial sections regarding the estate.
Elaine Whitfield had buried her husband 3 days ago, and now she was sitting across from a lawyer who was about to bury everything she thought she knew about him. The house was quiet in the way houses only get after a funeral, when the flowers start to wilt and the casseroles stop coming. She folded her hands in her lap, the way she always did when she wanted to look calmer than she felt. The lawyer slid a single folder across the table, and for a moment neither of them said a word. Then he looked her in the eye and said the sentence that would change everything she believed about her marriage, her family, and the man she thought she had loved completely for 31 years. He told her the house was not hers. He told her the money that paid for her children's college tuition, the money that covered every emergency surgery, every mortgage payment during the years Robert was out of work, every quiet rescue that had kept the Whitfield family afloat. None of it had ever truly belonged to them. It had been borrowed, he said, against a debt so old that almost no one alive could explain where it had come from or why it existed at all. Elaine felt the room tilt slightly. She asked him to repeat himself, and he did, slower this time, as if she were a child who needed the truth broken into smaller pieces before she could swallow it. For 30 years, someone had been paying their bills. Quietly, faithfully, without a single letter of explanation, without a name attached, without ever once asking for anything in return. Elaine had noticed the money over the years, of course she had, but Robert always had an answer ready. A bonus, an investment that paid off, a stroke of luck. She believed him because that is what wives do when the alternative is unthinkable. Tonight, sitting in a lawyer's office with her husband barely cold in the ground, she was about to find out why a stranger had been paying for her family's survival for 3 decades, and what her husband had done to deserve it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The lawyer opened the folder slowly, almost reluctantly, as though he already knew that whatever came next could not be taken back once it was said out loud. Inside was a single bank record, decades old, water-stained at the corner, listing payments that stretched back to a year before Elaine and Robert were even married. She stared at the numbers. They meant nothing to her, and everything at the same time. Whoever had been sending this money had been doing it since before she existed in Robert's life at all, which meant this was never about her, and it was never really about the family either. It was about something Robert had done long before she ever knew him, something he had carried silently into every year of their marriage without letting it show on his face even once. That night, after the lawyer left, Elaine walked through the house that no longer felt like hers. She stood in front of the old wooden desk in Robert's study, the one drawer he always kept locked, the one she had never questioned because a marriage runs on small, comfortable silences. She found the key exactly where he had hidden it for 30 years, taped beneath the drawer above it, as if some part of him had always wanted her to find it eventually, just not while he was still alive to watch her face when she did. Her hands were shaking as she turned the lock. Whatever was inside that drawer had been waiting for her far longer than she had been waiting for the truth. Somewhere in this city, another family was about to receive a phone call that would connect their story to the Whitfields in a way neither of them could have predicted. A woman named Corinne Ash had been living quietly for decades, carrying her own version of this secret, never expecting the day would come when a grieving widow would knock on her door asking questions about a man she had spent 30 years trying not to think about. 2 families, bound together by a debt neither of them fully understood, were about to collide over one locked drawer and one folder of bank records that should have stayed buried forever. By the end of tonight, Elaine Whitfield would know exactly what her husband had done, and she would wish, more than anything, that she never had to find out. To understand how Elaine Whitfield ended up standing in front of a locked drawer with shaking hands, you first have to understand who the Whitfields actually were before that night, because on the surface, there was nothing unusual about this family at all. Robert Whitfield had spent 30 years working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of steady, unremarkable job that never made headlines and never raised questions. Elaine had raised their 2 children, Grace and Daniel, in the same quiet suburban home where she now sat alone. To their neighbors, their church, and even to their closest friends, the Whitfields looked like exactly what they appeared to be, an ordinary American family who had simply worked hard and gotten a little lucky along the way. Nobody ever imagined there was a second story running underneath the one everybody could see. But 3 questions were about to tear that ordinary story apart, and every one of them led back to a man who could no longer answer for himself, who had been paying the Whitfield family's way for 3 decades, quietly, faithfully, without ever once asking for recognition or repayment. What had Robert Whitfield done, sometime before his children were even born, that made this debt so heavy it required 30 years of silent payments to keep it from surfacing? And why, the very week he died, did those payments stop completely, replaced instead by an unsigned letter that seemed to be waiting for exactly this moment to finally be read? Grace Whitfield, 29 years old, and the more skeptical of Robert's 2 children, had always sensed there was something her father kept just out of reach. She remembered small moments now, replaying them with new eyes. The way he would go quiet whenever a certain company name came up in conversation. The way he flinched once at a photograph in an old newspaper and quickly changed the subject. Daniel, her older brother, had never wanted to look too closely at anything that might complicate the comfortable version of their father he preferred to remember. That difference between them, one sister determined to dig and one brother determined to leave the past buried, was about to become the fault line that split this family wide open in the weeks ahead. What none of the Whitfields knew yet was that somewhere across the city, a woman named Corinne Ash had spent those same 30 years watching the calendar just as closely as Robert had. Every payment that arrived at the Whitfield house had a mirror on her end, a quiet transaction she never spoke of to anyone, tied to an event so painful she had spent decades trying to convince herself it no longer mattered. She was not a stranger to this story. She was, in ways the Whitfield children could not yet imagine, standing at the very center of it. And when Grace finally opened that locked drawer in her father's study, she would find the first thread connecting her family's entire fortune to a woman she had never once heard her father mention. Robert Whitfield was not born into money, and he never pretended otherwise. He grew up in a modest 3-bedroom house 2 towns over, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher, the kind of upbringing that taught him to stretch every dollar and never waste anything, including trust. He met Elaine at 24, at a mutual friend's wedding, and by every account from the people who knew them then, it was the kind of meeting neither of them ever fully got over. She used to tell Grace and Daniel that their father proposed 6 weeks later, standing in a parking lot in the rain, because he said he couldn't wait one more day to ask her properly. It was the kind of story that made their marriage sound like the beginning of a simple, uncomplicated life. For a long time, everyone who loved them believed exactly that. But Elaine noticed things, even back then, that she chose not to examine too closely. Robert always had money when it mattered most, and it never quite matched what an accountant's salary should have allowed. When Grace needed braces the family couldn't technically afford, the money appeared. When Daniel's college tuition came due during the 1 year Robert was between jobs, the money appeared again, as if summoned. Robert always had an explanation ready, a bonus from the firm, a smart investment that finally paid off, a stroke of luck at exactly the right time. Elaine believed him, not because the explanations were airtight, but because believing him was easier than imagining the alternative. That is what 30 years of marriage can do to a person's instincts. It teaches them which questions are safe to ask and which ones are better left alone. Grace Whitfield grew up watching her father a little too closely, even as a child, without fully understanding why. She remembered the drawer in his study that was always locked, the one he never explained and she never dared ask about, tucked beneath a stack of tax files that made it look boring enough to ignore. She remembered a specific afternoon when she was maybe 11 years old, flipping through an old newspaper for a school project, when her father walked past, glanced at the page over her shoulder, and went completely still. He didn't say anything. He simply took the newspaper from her hands, folded it closed, and told her to go wash up for dinner. She never saw that particular article again, and she never thought to ask what had been on the page that made her father's face lose its color so quickly. Daniel Whitfield remembered his father differently, or perhaps he simply chose to. To Daniel, Robert was steady, dependable, the kind of father who showed up to every baseball game and never raised his voice, even during the hardest years. Daniel built his entire understanding of his father around that steadiness, and he had no interest in disturbing it now that Robert was gone. Where Grace saw a locked drawer and wanted answers, Daniel saw a grieving mother who needed peace, and a father whose memory deserved to stay exactly as clean as he had always presented it. This difference between them, small and unspoken for most of their lives, was about to become impossible to ignore. There was one more detail that no one in the Whitfield family ever fully explained, not even to each other. Every year, on a date in early March that never seemed to connect to any birthday or anniversary anyone could name, Robert would disappear for the entire day. He never said where he went. Elaine stopped asking after the third or fourth year, filing it away as one of her husband's small, harmless eccentricities, the kind every marriage eventually learns to live around. Grace, watching from the edges the way children often do, noticed that her father always came home from those trips a little quieter than usual, a little more distant for a few days afterward, as though he had been somewhere that cost him something to visit. She never knew that March was the same month, every single year, that a woman named Corinne Ash visited a grave 200 miles away, and that for one single day each year, without either of them ever exchanging a single word, Robert Whitfield had been standing somewhere nearby. The morning Robert Whitfield died began like any other morning in that house. Elaine remembered making coffee while he read the paper at the kitchen table, remembered him complaining lightly about his knee acting up again, remembered nothing in his voice or his face that suggested anything was wrong. He collapsed 2 hours later at his desk downtown, a sudden heart attack that gave no warning and left no time for goodbyes. It was the kind of death that leaves the people left behind replaying every small, ordinary moment before it, searching for a sign they now realize was never there to find. Elaine would later say that the hardest part wasn't losing him. It was realizing that the last conversation they ever had was about his knee, when there had clearly been so much more he never got the chance, or never chose, to say. Within a week of the funeral, the mystery account that had quietly funded the Whitfield family for 30 years went silent for the first time anyone could remember. No explanation arrived, no phone call, nothing to mark the end of something that had run so steadily in the background of their lives that none of them had ever stopped to imagine it could simply stop. In its place came a single unsigned letter, delivered to the house with no return address, containing nothing but a date from 3 decades earlier and a short string of numbers that meant nothing to Elaine at all. She almost threw it away, assuming it was some kind of clerical mistake. Something told her to keep it instead, folded inside her purse, where it sat for 2 full days before she finally showed it to her daughter. Grace recognized immediately that this was not a mistake. The date on the letter matched almost exactly to the years her father had worked at a company she barely remembered him mentioning, a firm that had collapsed in disgrace before she was even born. She spent that night doing what her brother refused to do, searching through old boxes in the garage, digging through her father's study drawer by drawer until she found the one that had always been locked. The key, when she finally located it taped beneath the drawer above, turned easier than she expected, as if it had been waiting a long time for someone to finally use it. Inside was a ledger, handwritten, water-stained at the edges, filled with dates and numbers that stretched back further than her own birth certificate. Every entry lined up, almost perfectly, with a payment the family had received over the years, tuition, medical bills, the down payment on the house she grew up in. But it was the very first page that stopped her cold, a single typed document tucked behind the ledger's front cover, bearing her father's name in a role at that failed company no one in the family had ever mentioned to her, not once, in 29 years. Grace sat on the floor of her father's study for nearly an hour before she could bring herself to read the document a second time, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less damning than they appeared. They did not. Whatever her father had done at that company, decades before she was old enough to understand any of it, had clearly cost someone else everything, and it had cost Robert Whitfield 30 years of silence to try and make it right. What she did not yet know, sitting alone in that quiet room with the ledger open in her lap, was that the woman on the other end of every single payment was still alive, still carrying her own half of this story, and was, at that very moment, only a few short weeks away from finally being found. Grace did not tell Daniel about the ledger right away. She sat with it for 3 days, reading and rereading the same handful of entries, trying to decide whether some truths were better left buried with the person who created them. But the questions would not leave her alone, and she finally laid everything out on her mother's kitchen table: the ledger, the letter, the document with her father's name on it. Daniel's reaction was immediate and sharp. He accused her of chasing shadows, of turning their father's quiet generosity into some kind of scandal simply because she could not accept that a good man could also have secrets. Elaine sat between them and said nothing for a long time, because some part of her had been waiting almost 30 years for exactly this conversation to happen. The lawyer who had first delivered the news, a careful man named Charles Whitmore, agreed to meet with Grace privately after she called him 3 times in a single afternoon. He was reluctant at first, citing the limits of what he was permitted to disclose, but something in Grace's voice on the phone told him she already knew more than she was letting on. When they finally sat down, he confirmed what the ledger suggested, that Robert had arranged these payments through a private account decades earlier, structured carefully enough that even the family's own accountant had never noticed the money moving through it. What he could not confirm, or perhaps would not, was who exactly was on the receiving end, only that the account had a name attached to it that legally could not be shared without her father's consent that had died with him. Grace turned next to a man named Harold Vance, her father's former business partner from decades earlier, one of the only people still alive who had worked alongside Robert at the company that collapsed. Harold agreed to meet her at a diner outside the city, visibly uncomfortable the moment she mentioned the ledger. He suggested carefully that perhaps Robert had simply made a series of smart investments over the years, and that Grace was reading too much into old paperwork that likely meant nothing at all. His explanation was smooth, almost rehearsed, and for a moment Grace nearly believed him. But something about the way his hands would not stay still on the table told her Harold Vance knew far more than he was willing to say, even if he was not, as she first suspected, the person actually connected to the payments. It was Daniel, of all people, who found the first real thread, despite insisting for weeks that he wanted no part of his sister's search. Going through his father's old email archive to close out an unrelated account, he stumbled across a folder buried 3 layers deep, labeled with nothing but a set of initials. Inside were scanned copies of old newspaper clippings, all covering the same company collapse from decades earlier, and all mentioning, in passing, a young woman named Corinne Ash who had lost everything when the firm folded. Daniel stared at the name for a long time before he finally picked up the phone and called his sister, the first time in weeks he had been the one to reach out first. Neither of them yet understood how close they were about to come to the woman who had spent 30 years standing quietly on the other side of their father's secret. It took Grace and Daniel almost 2 weeks to track down Corinne Ash, now 62 years old, and living quietly in a small house 200 miles from where they grew up. She did not answer the phone when they called, so Grace finally drove there herself, sitting in the car outside for nearly 20 minutes before she found the courage to knock. When Corinne opened the door and saw Grace's face, something shifted in her expression immediately, a recognition that startled them both, because Grace looked so much like a photograph of a young Robert Whitfield that Corinne had kept hidden in a drawer for 30 years. Corinne did not ask who she was. She simply stepped back from the door and said, quietly, that she had been expecting someone from that family to eventually come find her. What Corinne told them that afternoon rearranged everything Grace and Daniel believed about their father. Decades earlier, Robert had worked as the junior accountant at a firm that handled investments for dozens of small local businesses, including a modest bakery owned by Corinne's father. When the firm's senior partners began quietly funneling client funds into a failing venture to cover their own losses, Robert discovered the fraud early, before it became public. He said nothing. He was 26 years old, newly engaged to Elaine, terrified of losing the only stable job he had ever had, and he told himself the problem would somehow resolve itself before anyone got hurt. It did not resolve itself. The firm collapsed 18 months later, and Corinne's father lost the bakery, lost his savings, and within a year, lost his health along with it, dying of a stress-related heart attack that Corinne had spent 30 years believing was entirely preventable. Robert was never criminally charged. He was too junior, too far removed on paper from the men who orchestrated the fraud. But he knew what his silence had cost, and he carried that knowledge every single day for the rest of his life. The payments began less than a year after Corinne's father died. Small at first, then steadily larger as Robert's career advanced, always anonymous, always untraceable back to him unless someone knew exactly where to look. It was never framed as charity in his own mind. Robert told Corinne, in the only letter he ever sent her directly, that he considered it a debt, not a gift, one he intended to keep paying for as long as he was able to breathe. Grace sat in Corinne's living room long after Daniel had gone quiet beside her, trying to hold two conflicting truths in her hands at once. Her father had failed someone badly enough to cost a man his life, and then spent 30 years trying to carry that weight without ever once letting his own family see the shape of it. Was he a coward for staying silent at 26? Or was he simply human, frightened and young and unable to see the full cost of the choice he was making in that moment? Was he a good man for what he did afterward? Or was 30 years of quiet payments simply the easiest way to manage his own guilt without ever having to face his family with the truth? Corinne, watching Grace wrestle with the question, finally spoke the words that would stay with both Whitfield children long after they left her house that day, telling them that she had forgiven their father a long time ago, though she was not entirely certain, even now, that he had ever fully forgiven himself. Grace thought she understood the whole story now. 30 years of guilt, 30 years of silent payments, a debt her father had spent his entire adult life trying to repay. But Corinne was not finished talking, and what she said next was the one thing neither Whitfield child had prepared themselves to hear. She told them that the payments had not only moved in one direction. Nearly 10 years earlier, once her own life had finally stabilized, once she had rebuilt something resembling security after decades of struggle, Corinne had quietly begun sending money back. Not the full amount, she was careful to explain, nothing close to what Robert had given her family over the years, but enough to ease the load she somehow knew he was still carrying, even though he had never once suggested she owed him anything at all. She explained that she never told Robert directly what she was doing, the same way he had never told her family who he really was. Instead, she funneled small amounts through a separate account tied loosely to his workplace, timed carefully around the years she knew, through quiet research of her own, that the Whitfield family had faced unexpected costs, a surgery, a lost job, a difficult year. Robert likely never fully understood where that extra cushion had come from during those specific stretches, though Corinne suspected, in the last few years of his life, that he had started to suspect. Two people, bound by a tragedy neither of them had chosen, had spent the last decade quietly taking care of each other from a careful distance, never speaking, never meeting, each one convinced the other did not know the full truth. Grace left Corinne's house that afternoon carrying something heavier and lighter at the same time. A father who had failed someone terribly at 26 years old, and a father who had spent every year afterward trying, imperfectly and privately, to make it right. Daniel, who had spent weeks resisting this entire search, was the one who finally said out loud what Grace had been unable to put into words herself, that maybe their father's greatest flaw and his greatest act of love had turned out to be exactly the same decision, made over and over again, for 30 years, without a single person ever asking him to. Elaine, when her children finally told her everything, sat quietly for a long time before she spoke. She said she almost wished she had never asked the lawyer to explain that folder in the first place. And then, just as quickly, she said she was grateful she finally understood the man she had spent her entire life loving, secrets and silence included. She said grief was complicated enough without also discovering that the person you buried had been carrying an entire second life of guilt and quiet repair, one you never saw because he had worked so hard, for 30 years, to make sure you never had to. So here is the question this story leaves behind, one that has no easy answer no matter how many times you turn it over. If you discovered tomorrow that someone you loved had spent 30 years quietly making up for a mistake they never told you about, would you want to know the truth, even if it changed everything you believed about who they were? Or would you rather have kept living inside the simpler, kinder story you had always been told? Before we dive deeper into the next story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And if you thought the Whitfield family's secret was hard to believe, wait until you hear what happened when another ordinary family discovered their entire inheritance was never really theirs to begin with. A story even more shocking than this one, coming up next right here on this channel.